Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boyles-Griffin, and I serve as the chair of the Advisory Committee for the Botstiber Institute for Wildlife Fertility Control. I also serve as a senior program director for the Wildlife Protection Department of the Humane Society of the United States. And Giovanna and I put together a presentation to share with you this morning, just to give everyone here that may be a little new to the field of wildlife fertility control a little bit of background about what kind of contraceptives are being used, are available, are registered in various parts of the world, some of the species and contexts that they're being used on right now. Giovanna covered some of that in her talk this morning. I'm going to go a little bit more into it. It's not advancing. Oh, there you go. So starting with some of the criteria that were developed over the last couple of decades to try and hone in on what an ideal contraceptive for wildlife really looks like. So here are a pretty exhaustive list. So one of them, to start with, is not having any sort of detrimental side effects on individual animal welfare or behavior. And then another one would be, and this is focusing on individuals, safe to use in pregnant animals. So we don't want anything that's going to harm a developing fetus. Another one is long-term effectiveness, and that's in most contexts. There are some species and contexts where an annual contraceptive, where an animal is highly approachable and accessible, you can get to them and treat them every year, might be ideal. Maybe in a closed population of deer, for instance, on an island, or wild horses. They manage wild horses on acetate by treating those animals annually with a contraceptive I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But in most cases, free-roaming animals, having something that, if it's one single dose, is effective for many years, is probably, from a logistics and an efficiency standpoint, going to be superior to something that has to be an animal that has to be treated frequently. Reversibility. In this case, it kind of depends. There are some species and contexts where having a single dose sterilant might actually be a good thing. But in most free-roaming native populations, as wildlife managers, having reversibility is also providing flexibility, because you never know over time what sort of catastrophic event might happen where you would want an animal to start reproducing again to contribute to the long-term genetic health of a herd. I'll use Assateague Island as an example again. We get some pretty intense tropical events that come up the Atlantic coast. And we never know, it's a relatively small population of animals, maybe about 100. You never know when an event could potentially take out a significant proportion of that population, especially with climate change. So making sure we have those animals on a fertility control agent that's reversible is really important. Single dose, multiple year. Remote delivery, whether it's oral or injectable, having delivery systems that allows just the species that you want to treat to get into a box and get whatever oral bait that you've put in there. Inexpensive to produce and administer, species specific in most contexts. No significant effect on the food chain if these animals are treated. I think Giovanna just mentioned this, hunters being concerned about eating an animal that's been treated with a fertility control agent of some kind. That also means if this animal dies or is killed, the predator is not going to be impacted in a detrimental way by ingesting the flesh of an animal that's been treated with it. And then deliverable to a large proportion of the population that's your target population. So one method that was started and tried very early on in the beginning of this field was just using surgical methods almost as a proxy to determine if you suspended population or reproduction, if it would have an impact on the short term and long term on population growth rates. And some of those methods that have been used on animals like deer, squirrels, and coyotes are ovariectomy, tubal ligation, vasectomy. And the pros are that it's permanent. You never have to touch the animal again. And as I said, it's a proxy for until we have a long-acting contraceptive that's been developed. The concern is that it's highly invasive, obviously. There are welfare concerns associated with it. I'll use the Scapin 2019 paper as an example. They thought that their project with gray squirrels in Italy was highly successful because they had a 94% survival rate. Well, that also means they had a 6% mortality rate. And for most research projects, when you go over 2%, that's the time to stop your study. That is actually considered an unacceptable mortality rate associated with your research. So probably really important as a field, we think about determining what the thresholds of what success looks like, whether you're using a surgical method or a non-surgical method of fertility control. The cons, again, it's non-reversible. That can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the species and the context. It's very labor intensive and it can be cost prohibitive. But I'll give you an example. So for the Bromley and Giese paper, they're using surgical sterilization in a population of coyotes that live near the red wolf recovery area in Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in North Carolina. They're trying to create a buffer and have those animals serve as placeholders so they do not hybridize with the endangered population of red wolves, but they do not allow the continued and very, very rapid influx of other coyotes from other parts of the state because you have animals that are serving as placeholders in an area where coyotes can be. So conservation use of some form of surgical sterilization, but it'd be interesting to see if researchers will find an injectable that they can use that would be a sterilant in this case. So a couple of the immunocontracetives, these are non-surgical agents that are available for use, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the science here, is GnRH-based immunocontraception vaccines, and then porcine zona pellucida. There are several studies. These two vaccines have been studied for years, and for both of them, on one or more doses, you can achieve 75% to 100% of animals infertile for 2 to 8 years. And there are lots of practical applications that are credible that are being used on several species. And for both of these agents, in some form or fashion, the mode of operation is very different for each of them, but they are in some way blocking a mode of fertilization. So for a normal GnRH, so this is a GnRH-based vaccine to work, normally the GnRH would stimulate the production of sex hormones for both males and females. So what you're doing is injecting them with an anti-GnRH. Those antibodies block the ability of GnRH to do what it's supposed to do, which is the production of sex hormones, and that's what suspends reproduction in both males and females when the animal receives a proper dose of it. Zona pellucida works a little differently. You're stimulating the production of antibodies that, in turn, are going to bind to the sperm receptor sites on a treated egg. You see an untreated egg, sperm receptor sites are open, a sperm can fertilize the egg, but on an animal that's been treated with porcine zona pellucida, they compete for those binding sites, and so it actually blocks fertilization at the egg. So it's a pretty elegant way of conducting fertility control in a lot of different mammal species. Then you have oral contraceptives for birds. Nicarbazine is one of them. It's used routinely to feed poultry to prevent bacteria in chickens. And it acts as a contraceptive by causing the yolk and the albumin to mix, so they're unhatchable. And then there are several oral contraceptives for rodents. The speakers that will be coming up behind me, Dr. Belmain and Dr. Jakob, they will be talking a little bit more about EP1. Contraceptive is a combination of 2 different active agents, VCD and triptylide. It's effective in rats. It's an oral contraceptive bait that is liquid that comes in a bait station that you can see the pictures of right there. It's registered in the US and it has to be delivered for more than 50 days. So those animals have to be eating that bait continuously in order for that contraceptive to be effective. And then EP1, it's effective in rodent species. It has to be delivered for around 7 days or 1 baiting event. It's been registered in Tanzania for rodent control. And again, Dr. Belmain and Dr. Jakob are going to be talking a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So with my final slides, so future work towards practical applications in fertility control. And this isn't just in Europe, this is everywhere. So we need additional field trials on some of these registered agents in other species and contexts. We still need a single-dose, multiple-year contraceptives for a lot of these species. In some cases, a single-dose permanent sterilant would be a good thing to have for some species. I always use the example of brumbies in Australia. These are not federally protected animals like wild horses are in the United States. And being able to use a single-dose sterilant where these animals that live in very remote areas, we're not going to be able to get to them very easily again. And they don't have a lot of other options because of where these animals exist in Australia. Oral contraceptive development for a lot of different species and context. Modeling, Dr. Schoenecker is going to be talking about a really unique modeling system that was developed for wild horse management in the United States, but that's one of many that we probably need for different species and contexts. So modeling the impact of fertility control on population growth rates over time, so wildlife managers can actually plan and budget for the amount of resources and work and labor that will be needed in order to implement these programs over time. Product registration in Europe. We have a couple of products registered in Europe, but one of the reasons that we're having this workshop is to try and identify some of the challenges that there may be to registering products that are wildlife fertility control agents in the future. Comparative management cost analysis. We just heard Gio talk a little bit about comparing lethal control methods to something that's non-lethal control where you're trying to suppress population growth rates. There's a huge assumption out there that it costs more to do wildlife fertility control, but without these modeling systems to actually show over time which actually costs more, continuing to cull a population over again or using fertility control over long periods of time, we're really not going to know which of the two or some combination of the two is actually a better management tool for a particular species or context. And then a lot of what we're going to be talking about today and tomorrow, managing public and policymaker expectations by getting better at communicating the science. And so just some follow-up points. So we have several registered products right now that are available for practical applications in the world. Additional field studies on logistics and comparative costs need to be done with various species and contexts, but there's a critical need in research and development for these long-acting single-dose agents, oral contraceptives, the identification systems we need to know which animals have been treated and which haven't, and then delivery systems for administering either injectable agents or oral agents to target species. And I'll take any questions that you might have.
Great talk, by the way, Stephanie. Single dose is practical, it seems, as a contraceptive, but is that really something that's absolutely necessary? I mean, it does seem to be that a single dose is something that would make a contraceptive more usable, but is that really a practical or reasonable requirement?
What I tell the Bureau of Land Management is that we have 2 really good immunocontraceptives that work really, really well when you administer 2. 1 primer and 1 booster 1 or 2 years afterwards. And that we should not let perfection be the enemy of progress. So I would agree with you that we have some really good agents that if we as the researchers building these different agents and testing them, share that information with the end users, that we need to help them build their programs around the way that these products work well, rather than them constantly asking us for what they need. But we also need to be listening to the needs of end users. Otherwise, we're developing products that no one's going to use because we're not listening to them and what they feel like their needs are. So that's what we tell the Forest Service, that's what we're telling Bureau of Land Management, just from that's, you know, the world that I live in with respect to species and context, is while we're trying to develop what you think you need, let's build your programs, your management programs around what you have already that works really well if you're developing your management programs around them. So it's a good question.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. That was brilliant. I wondered about the identification methods. How do you go about identifying the animals that have been treated? And also, sort of secondary, there was a point made earlier about how hunters were quite nervous about the idea of contraceptives in case they end up eating the animal. But surely, if the animal is identifiable, then that risk is mitigated.
So I'll start by saying that I'm not an expert in identification, okay? There are some people in this room that are presenting posters that have a lot of experience using marker darts and ear tagging animals. There are people that are working with cats and dogs, free-roaming cats and dogs that are starting to use tattoos in ears that are ultraviolet and in some cases can be seen in the dark. The problem is there are a lot of dogs and cats that have floppy ears or they have furry ears. And so, you know, there's not one identification system that's going to work for every species and context, and that's what makes this challenging is you almost have to develop a different delivery and identification system for almost every species and context. There is some overlap there. But one of the challenges with some of these larger hooved animals is in the past we've been using ear tags. The problem is that's labor intensive and there are some welfare concerns associated with it because you have to chemically immobilize them in order to do that. From that point forward, then you can dart them remotely and not have to do that. We'd love to get to a point where people feel comfortable enough with the idea that these animals are being treated with these agents that don't move through the food chain, aren't going to have a harmful impact on the environment or, non-target or secondary animals, that we can do saturation darting, that we don't have to individually mark all those, or maybe AI and photo ID technology is going to allow us to be able to identify animals, know how many times she's been treated, whether she's due for a booster. So we really hope that innovation is going to solve some of these problems, repurposing innovation that's been developed for one application and being able to apply it to some of these things. But there are some really exciting things that are starting to be done with things like drones and everything. So there's no telling what the future holds with this, but right now it's pretty challenging.